Hey, You're Up family, it's David. Just want to bring a little devotional video for you today on the topic of silence and how life and death are in the power of our tongue, like Proverbs says. Many of you have seen the topic of racial injustice going around in our nation of America, and we're taking a stand and believing the Lord's heart for reconciliation in that area. But maybe you've seen the topic of silence going around, how our silence on this topic specifically is deafening and speaks volumes as to where we take a stand and as where we stand on this issue. Well, that's so true, and I believe that. I want to talk on silence from a bit of a personal perspective and even take it down a different route, and talk a little bit about life and death being in the power of the tongue. Like I said, a little backstory from my personal experience. I have a long history of giving into silence as opposed to taking a stand for what I believe in, speaking out in boldness when the Lord gives me an opportunity to share the gospel or things like that. I have a tendency to give into silence. And in recent years, I've started to dive in to, okay, where does this come from? Why is this the first tendency for me? And it's crazy, when I was born, my middle name means one whose voice makes a difference. My middle name is Telemachus. Super crazy. You've probably never heard that name before. But who Telemachus was a monk in the 4th century in Italy. And he was martyred because he took a stand against the gladiator fights that were happening in the Roman Colosseum. And it was crazy. He saw it for the first time, was so appalled that man was fighting man for sport that he got down on the sand in the Colosseum and shouted for the fights to stop. And he was killed by the crowd, who was stoned. But after that day, there was never another gladiator fight in Rome because conviction hit the hearts of everyone that was there that day. And it's just a powerful story of someone's voice making a difference. And that's what that's who I was named after. And I've known that my whole life growing up hearing it. But for so long, I gave in to silence and the exact opposite of my voice making a difference. And I believe it's so it's advantageous of the enemy when he sees that things are spoken over our lives, callings, giftings, or spoken over your life, spoken over my life, that he is going to do everything in his power to see the exact opposite happen. To see, if my name means one whose voice makes a difference, if that's what God's saying over me, he wants to see the exact opposite. And I believe the same is true in your life, that the number one thing the enemy is attacking is probably what God wants to see, the most strong aspect of our lives, if that makes any sense. And I also want to just talk about the topic of power of our tongue and life and death stemming from our tongues. Proverbs 18:21 says, life and death are in the power of the tongue. And I believe that's so true. We as Christians have the opportunity to speak up, to speak life, or we have the opportunity to speak death. But I also believe that if we stand in that middle ground, we're withholding life. And I believe that goes for sharing the gospel or speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves. Proverbs 31, verse 8, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. If we're withholding life by not speaking life, by not speaking the truth of the gospel, by not standing for those who can't stand or speak for themselves, I believe ultimately that leads to death. And I want to propose, that we as Christians have the responsibility and the opportunity to present the gospel at all times with everyone. And when we don't, that ultimately leads to death. And it ultimately is partnering with the power of death from our tongue. And it's a little intense, I know, but there's a story of a famous atheist who obviously lifelong reputation of opposing Christianity and the idea and the reality of there being a God and all of that. But something that they said that has always hit me so powerfully was, if Christians who so believe that Jesus is the only way to the Father, the only way to life, the only way to avoid spending eternity in hell, if Christians believe that that is true, how much would they have to hate somebody to not present the gospel in that way? To not present the only way to escape eternity in hell? How much would a Christian have to despise somebody to not present the gospel to them? And I believe that's so true, man. When we are not presenting the gospel, when given the opportunity, we are ultimately partnering with death and with withholding life from our tongues. So I just want to challenge us, man, when we're given the opportunity to speak the gospel, to present the gospel, and even like Proverbs 31 says, to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, speak for the mute and the destitute. If we're not speaking life, if we're not speaking the gospel and partnering with Jesus in that way, man, it ultimately is producing death in the people that God brings by our lives. So, man, challenge for us this week. Let's find 5, 10, 15 people, maybe as things are starting to lift in your country, quarantines are starting to lift. Let's find people to reach out to and share the gospel, to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to partner with justice in a lot of these areas and these themes that we're seeing in our nations and in our world today. So I love you guys so much. Let's speak the gospel. Let's speak life and partner with life in our lives today. So have a great rest of your day and week. Be blessed.